Hey everybody, welcome to our second Say It Brave virtual event, and tonight is going to be really special. We're talking about breaking the cycle, moving from self-sabotage to self-awareness. This is a big topic. I know from a lot of you it's been on your minds and hearts, and we have a very special friend, Robyn Cruze from Wide Wonder, who's going to be sharing her heart with us, her story, and we hope to really dig deep tonight and that this is useful for all of us. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So welcome. Many of you know me. I'm Shannon Kropp. I'm a national recovery advocate, and I co-lead the Say It Brave team with Ashley, and it really is such an honor to chat with you guys every single week about really raw, brave, honest topics. And I'm just grateful to be here. Ashley, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Ashley Solomon. I have some allergy stuff going on tonight, so I apologize if I'm doing a little bit of coughing, but despite that, I'm so excited to be here. This is our second online event, and it's a topic that I know is going to generate some really, really cool discussion. I'm so grateful to Robyn for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Robyn Cruze, and I'm the co-founder of Wide Wonder. I am currently in a bus in Portland, Oregon. I kid you not. You can see me. This is the bus window. Wide Wonder is a family initiative that my husband and I created about a year ago. We decided that we were going to sell our home and convert a school bus into a tiny home and travel the United States to inspire hope and a new narrative for mental health and addiction. And so I'm reporting to you from there. And I'm super, super excited to be here. I do want to say to Ashley and Shannon, hand on heart, very, very honored to be here with you two. You inspire me constantly, and I'm just excited to be a part of what you're creating here. I think it's very powerful. So thanks for having me.
Well, Robyn, we feel the same about you.
Mm-hmm.
Robyn is bussing down stigma around mental health, and it's just the coolest thing. I really encourage you, if you're not already following her family's adventures on social media, to do so right away, because it's really, really cool, and they share some awesome stuff, not just about their journey, but also great resources and just educational pieces and all kinds of fun things like that. So I'm curious about, for those of you with us tonight, if when you saw that our topic was on this concept of moving from self-sabotage to self-awareness, kind of what might have been evoked in you, because I know that for myself, self-sabotage it's kind of a prickly word. There's a lot of stigma in and of itself around this concept. And so we wanted to start out really by defining what it is we're talking about, because in some ways I think we have this idea in our mind that self-sabotage is something that really maybe dysfunctional people do, or indicate some deep inherent problem. And really, it's not like that at all. It's really a pattern of self-defeating behaviors that interfere with our values, our goals, or our objectives. And I think on lots of levels, all of us can relate to that. So I think we want to really emphasize that this is not a moral deficit. It's not a flaw in your character if you struggle with self-sabotaging behaviors. It's actually not really a trait at all. You notice we're not saying, that you're a self-sabotager. It's really about a set of behaviors that, and all of us have individual specific behaviors that we struggle with from time to time. And I think it's important do you mind going back, Shannon, one slide? That's okay. She's really excited for us to get to all this good stuff. But I think it's just really important. As I said, we we all engage in this behavior, or these behaviors, and it can look so many different ways. But I think it's really important to start from this foundation that we can't look honestly at self-sabotage without being willing to sort of, as Brene Brown would say, like enter the arena, or just be willing to kind of lean into the ickiness that sometimes thinking about this stuff can bring up for us. Lots of, shame or embarrassment or guilt, because we'd like to think that it's, if we set a goal for ourselves, we're going to go after it, and that's what we're going to do. And that if we self-sabotage, maybe we weren't really committed, or maybe something's, again, like inherently wrong with us. But honestly, sometimes we self-sabotage because there's just so much competing for our time and our energy and, the essence of who we are. And so if you want to go to the next slide, we are talking about a lot of different sort of concepts here when we're thinking about self-sabotage. And we really want to point out that while even this list might seem like, behaviors that we should quote unquote know better than doing, there's a lot of things that we do to self-sabotage that are actually highly revered in our culture. Things like working too much, or giving too much of ourselves to others in ways that end up undermining our own values or our ability to kind of work towards the things that are important to us. And, so when we think about all the socially sanctioned things in our world that can contribute to us just breaking down and not being able to be the people we want to be, I think it's understandable why so many of us struggle with this. I think what I was just thinking about, a self-sabotaging behavior that I tend to do, which is I feel super embarrassed to say this. I want to name as I share it, but I never floss my teeth ever. And I hate it. And I go to the dentist every single time and they lecture me about it because they can tell and they're worried about my gums, as they should be, and they tell me about it, and they tell me all the ways that it's easy to fit into my schedule and it only takes 1 minute, and here we'll give you a sample. Like, everything is given to me to be successful. And yet I say it's too hard, or I don't have time. I mean, I can't spare that 1 minute. And I have problems the next time. And so, I mean, it's a somewhat silly example, but I think I just wanted to highlight that because it's, despite what some might say about my dental hygiene, I do care about my teeth, and yet I just can't seem to do it. So whatever your self-sabotaging behaviors might be, whether it's, going to some of the same places that are difficult for you to avoid unhealthy behaviors, or starting an argument with someone, or going to bed late when you know how important sleep hygiene is for your mental health. We want you to know that we totally get it, and you don't have to explain yourself here. So I'm going to turn it over to Shannon, or actually I'm not yet. So one of the things we want to do is we want to understand what the function of the self-sabotaging behavior is and why we engage in this. And sometimes this can help sort of fight that stigma that we have against self-sabotage. I think that one of the core reasons that we self-sabotage is that oftentimes it just seems so much simpler in the moment. And there's actually a really good reason for that. One of the things that I talk to patients about quite a bit is the fact that when we develop habits, the way that we develop them from a neurological perspective in our brain is that we are forming neural pathways every single time we engage in a behavior. Our neural pathways deepen. I think about it like, digging out a path. And so when we're faced with sort of similar situations or triggers again, it is simpler to go down the sort of paved path versus starting to dig out a new neural pathway, a new behavior and habit. And so in many ways it appears and actually is simpler for us, and it lets us sort of stick to a lot of maybe the stories that we've told about ourselves, I mean, I can say I have a very firm story that I am not an athlete. And so my default, if someone asks me to participate in something, is automatically something, that requires some level of physical coordination, is to sort of repeat my story, oh no, that's not for me. And that's because we as human beings like to stick to, again, the familiar, what helps us sort of stick to our script. And sometimes these types of behaviors do that for us. And one of the most important reasons that we're really going to get into tonight, especially, is that it often allows us to avoid uncomfortable emotions. And we all struggle as well with uncomfortable emotions. All of us, no matter how we were raised or taught to think about emotions, if they're uncomfortable, they're often uncomfortable for a reason, and that's evolutionary. So tonight we're really going to get into how do we move from a place of using self-sabotage to sort of stick to our script and avoid what feels uncomfortable, to really opening up our sort of hearts and minds to leaning into to self-awareness.
Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah.
I just want to share briefly with you guys 2 examples of self-sabotage in my life, and really what my greatest struggle with any self-sabotaging behavior, especially once I become aware of it, it's that shame Ashley was talking about, the secrecy, this idea that I'm supposed to be, that not everybody does this, that I'm this flawed, damaged human being, and I can't tell another person or ask for help around this behavior. I need to figure it out. I need to keep it locked inside myself and deal with it in my mind. And that never usually works out well for me. So it was interesting because as I was thinking about self-sabotage, I was thinking a lot about, and many of you know my story, when I started working at the San Diego Humane Society a few months after I was discharged from eating disorder treatment. And I relapsed, and I was stuck in a vicious cycle of relapse, the worst that I'd ever known. And the self-sabotaging, yes, it was the eating disorder. It was night after night, binging and not getting enough sleep and engaging in my eating disorder all night long, and then waking up late the next day and rushing to work. But the daily behavior, in addition to the eating disorder, it was that pretending and pushing through day after day after day, not slowing down. And this picture you can see on the right, it really breaks my heart to see, but I know exactly where I was at then. I had binged all night long. I totally forgot I had an interview with a reporter about the adoptable dog in my lap the next day. I wasn't dressed for the interview. I hadn't taken a shower or washed my hair. And yet she was there at 9 a.m. with cameras, and I was there, just full of shame and disgust, and I had to, get on TV now. And I really wish that I had found the strength to say that day, you know what, enough of this pushing through, enough of this pretending, enough of this doing it on my own. Let me tell the truth to somebody. But like Ashley's saying, this was familiar to me. The eating disorder was familiar to me. Not asking for help was familiar to me. The idea of really telling someone how bad it got, that brought a whole lot of uncertainty. Would I need to go to treatment again? Would they challenge my eating disorder in ways I couldn't handle? And so even though it clearly wasn't safer to stay in this pattern of bulimia and denial and bulimia and pretend and pushing through, it felt safer. And really the only thing for me that broke this pattern of pretend and not asking for help and watching the eating disorder just get stronger and stronger, it was finally reaching to a point of so much pain that I admitted to my therapist I hadn't been being honest with her. I was struggling more than I knew what to do with, and I didn't see a way out. And it felt like one of the weakest moments of my life, but I look back and it's one of the bravest, it's one of the strongest things I ever did, was let somebody else into my struggle with self-sabotage. And with her help and the rest of my treatment team, eventually we did come up with a plan, and I did find my way out of that vicious cycle. And I just want to honor anybody who's, in a really hard place, in a cycle that feels bigger than them. I think the most important first step is really asking for help. And it maybe doesn't seem like such a big deal, but it really is. It's really, really a big deal. And it's really the start of this shift towards self-awareness we're talking about. Later in life, actually not too long ago, I backed my car into my husband's car in the driveway. And that was because I was self-sabotaging in a different way. I was doing something my therapist and I called chaos creating, which was saying yes to everything, taking on too many projects, never saying no, never setting boundaries, thinking I was Superwoman. And my brain was always spinning and I was never where my body was. And so I was in the car one morning, I was thinking about everything I had to do, and I just slammed into my husband's, and it was his brand new car, 2 days old, brand new car. That's what makes it even worse. And it took that for me to kind of wake up, startle myself awake and say, this isn't working for me, and this is a big deal. Sometimes, like Ashley was saying, self-sabotaging behaviors are admired in our society, when we're doing so much and we're being productive and we're giving of ourselves, but it's at the detriment of our own souls. And I brought, this was easier to bring to my therapist, but it still required a lot of work. I realized that I was chaos creating because I grew up in a very chaotic environment, an alcoholic home, and the chaos was familiar to me. It was comfortable, and I like that kind of adrenaline rush all day long, that feeling of self-importance. And so, talking about this in therapy and asking for help, I thought it was going to be this quick conversation and over and done with, but it became a really huge opening and gateway for me into a new way of living and being in the world that required a lot of help from my therapist and my family, and setting boundaries, and a total lifestyle change that was so totally worth it. And so I just wanted to share with you guys these 2 examples of self-sabotage and how much I struggled to bring them out of myself into a safe person like my therapist, how much I struggled to stop hiding them, but how important and brave it is when we do finally say the truth out loud to a safe person, and how that for me is where the journey to self-awareness begins.
Gotta unmute myself. So what we wanted to do was to share with you a little bit more about some of the reasons that this happens, and in part to sort of normalize this experience, because what I'm about to share with you happens to all of us, regardless of who you are. So something that Daniel Goleman likes to call emotional hijacking, and I just love this explanation because to me it's really validating for why it can be much easier to react in a moment, and to do again what feels familiar or safe rather than what might be most effective. So a little bit of a brain lesson for a second. I promise we won't get too deep into this, but basically what's important to know is that when we experience an intense emotion, there are multiple parts of the brain, as most of us are aware. There's the higher cortex, or cerebral cortex, which is essentially the more advanced and newer brain. And then beneath that is the lower brain, which involves the parts of the brain that really developed, as long ago as there were dinosaurs on the earth. So sometimes we call it the reptilian brain, kind of our original brain. And so that original brain, that lower brain that doesn't have sort of advanced thought and is able to reason and make sense of things and to assess and analyze. That's all the stuff that the cerebral cortex, that higher brain, does. But the lower brain is actually where emotion gets processed and where our information first goes before it goes to the higher cortex. And what happens when we get information from our environment that, someone has really angered us, or we realize we are going to be late on something, that information goes through our amygdala, which is kind of the emotional processing part of the brain. And what the amygdala and the hippocampus do is they work in connection with each other to process that information. And they can really only do two things. They label emotion as pleasant or unpleasant, and then they give a command. And that command is whether we should approach this situation, whether we should avoid it, or whether we should ignore it. So there's a very limited controls that it has, but those are powerful. So the amygdala is really sort of putting its spin on whatever happens to us before our rational brain has a chance to even really think through what it is we want to do, how we want to handle this situation, and how we can make it most effective. And especially for those of us who have experienced things like really painful experiences in the past, trauma, all of that gets activated because the hippocampus, that's the memory part of our brain, all of that's getting activated as those experiences are going through that process. And so we can react in sort of old ingrained ways based on what our emotional brain is telling us. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can harness that and how we can develop some more control. But it's important to know when we're thinking about self-sabotage that a lot of those behaviors come out of the fact that we're operating based on how our brain is telling us. It's just our old brain, and we haven't been able to activate our newer, sort of more advanced brain. So the other thing to know is that many of us are very accustomed to, we mentioned emotional avoidance. Sometimes we don't like the way that process goes, that emotional hijacking. So our way of dealing with it is just to kind of suppress and avoid any experience that could elicit sort of negative feelings in us. And we tend to not be all that successful at that, of course, because we can't totally avoid pain because we're human beings, and that's kind of part of the deal here on Earth. But meanwhile, our culture and the people around us often reinforce this idea that we should always be experiencing positive emotions. We're really, as a culture, not very comfortable with what it means to have difficult feelings or to feel like someone is upset. We often just don't know how to respond. It hasn't been, we don't make that visible. And so many of us feel like that there's not a place for that. So it makes sense that a really effective strategy often for shutting down emotions quickly is to do things that end up being self-sabotaging in their function. Whether that's I'm feeling this really like anxious urge to know the answer to a question, and so and whether somebody is interested in me, and so I can't tolerate that feeling, so I have to either numb it out by doing something that will help me sort of feel it less. I need to feel like I can get my answer right away so that I don't have to sort of sit with this worry. So it leads us down some pretty difficult paths when we're operating from a place of feeling that we can't sort of sit with our emotions. And again, it's hard. None of us are saying that is easy, and we will all continue to emotionally avoid in certain ways from here till forever. But we want to be able to learn to come into contact with our feelings as much as we can.
Wow, that is so much information, Ashley, but really good information, and it makes me think about, I've been in recovery from eating disorder behavior and also substance use for 15 years now. And when you both invited me to talk about self-sabotage and self-awareness, I got this spike of anxiety, to be really honest with you, because the self-sabotage didn't sit right with me. And I think it didn't sit right with me because I've been in it, like you said, we're humans, and this concept that being in long-term recovery or being a mental health advocate, somehow it puts us up on this thing that we're some authority, when actually wherever we are in our mental health recovery process, we are advocates, and being an advocate is about showing up for ourselves, honoring ourselves, and going through the work ourselves. So anyway, when I was thinking about self-sabotage, I started to do a search on the websites, on the internet, what is self-sabotage? And I found this story, and so I hope you don't mind, I'm going to quickly read it to you. So it's from this website called agilelifestyle.net. It says, once upon a time, there was an eagle who lived like a chicken. His owner loved the eagle so much that he fed it chicken feed and kept it in a barn with other chickens so it would never go hungry. One day, a man passing by asked the owner why the eagle, proudest of all the birds, was living in a barn with chickens. His owner said, I love my eagle so much. I have given it chicken feed every day and kept it safe in the barn. It no longer needs to hunt or fly. The man was curious at this. He wanted to know if the eagle really had lost its ability to fly. So he picked up the eagle and said, you belong in the sky and not to the earth. Stretch forth your wings and fly. The eagle gave him a curious look and jumped down from out of his hands and went back to eat chicken feed off the dirt. The next day, the man tried again. He went to the roof of the house with the eagle and said, you belong in the sky and not the earth. Stretch forth your wings and fly. The eagle, fearing the height, wiggled free from the human and jumped back down to the ground to be with the other chickens. Finally, on the third day, the man took the eagle to the top of the mountain and said, you belong in the sky and not to the earth. Stretch forth your wings and fly. The eagle, trembling but seeing no way down from the mountain, stretched his wings and flew, slowly at first, but then up, up and away towards the sun. What's the moral to this story? The eagle had it in him all along, but his upbringing and lack of belief in himself led to self-sabotage. And it says that the self-sabotage definition is self-sabotage is when part of your personality acts in conflict with another part of your personality. And I think that really kind of relates to what you were saying about not being able to see that we self-sabotage a lot. When I look at what I perceive now to be self-sabotage, my self-sabotage behaviors have really been disguised in this, I'm just being ambitious. I'm just being empowered. I'm just being what the Nike says, just do it. Right? I'm just being a badass, right? So there's all these things that I can say that I am, and all that time I am living my ambition, my empowerment is really driven by my sense of deep, profound fear that I am not enough. And that gets me to a point of feeling so exhausted in my life. Overworking, all these things that you see on this slide, overworking, placing my self-care last, not asking for help, the eating disorder behavior and the substance use behavior when I was back in practicing that. But when I stopped practicing that, because they were ways for me to numb and keep that sense of fear down. When I stopped doing those behavior, I took on other things. And so the overworking and the living in financial fear that drove me to work more, worrying about what people thought of me, which drove me to do other behaviors, which stopped me from putting my self-care first. There are very simple things that I know that work for my mental health that I must do daily in order to feel centered. And for many, many years, long into my recovery, I have put those last. And that is something that I had to realize. I'll just tell you a quick story. When people ask, the self-sabotage and me being on the bus really is quite, it goes together quite well, because when about 2 years ago, my wonderful, very hard-working dad in Australia had to be put into an assisted living at a very young age. He was 73 years old, and my dad also struggled with anxiety and depression, and had his own, substance use. And it's the way that he coped. 73 years old. He came from a different generation, different era. Men did not speak about their stories. They certainly didn't talk about self-sabotage or recovery. And so my dad, very strong, kept himself alive by himself up until the age of 73. And at that point, we had to help him by putting him into assisted living, and so that he could continue living his life. And I had been very, very busy. I'd been traveling a lot, speaking a lot. And I love my job, and I'll never apologize for the amount that I love doing what I do. But I was working myself into the ground, and I was doing it because I feared that I wanted somebody to be happy with me. I wanted to feel like I was doing a lot of work, and when I finished doing some work, it didn't feel like it was enough. So I got into this kind of trap of thinking that that's what I needed to do, and it became a quite an effort, quite a cycle, I guess you could say. But when I went home to Australia and I put my dad into an assisted living, I remember looking at him and having that moment of, wow, life is so short, and the difference between my dad and myself is that I got recovery, and he was not given that opportunity at when he was growing up, when he was my age. And it really struck me that there he was in assisted living, and I had this profound freeness because I had had recovery, and yet somehow that freeness scared me, and I had to put myself into a box. And while I wasn't acting on eating disorder behavior, I was not claiming the person that I knew I could be. Does that make sense? And so when I got home, I started having panic and anxiety attacks, which I have learned that it really is my body's way of saying, Rob, I need you to slow down. I need you to stop. I need you to listen to me, because you are not. And I am screaming here, hello, hear me. And for me, squashing it down is that self-sabotage. And I think this self-sabotage thing, I think sometimes many of us in recovery, we've spent so long being stuck, I wonder if the self-sabotage is just another way that we feel, much like the eating disorder behavior, where we feel that we're protecting ourselves in some way where we don't feel so exposed because life is so big. And sometimes saying no and having boundaries and saying, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm filled up. My calendar is filled. My mind is filled. My resources are down. Sometimes that's too hard. And so I wonder if self-sabotage for me is being willing to honor myself where I'm at, because sometimes it's just easier to put those, I think you mentioned that actually sometimes it's easier to do the self-sabotaging things because it takes an effort to do that. My husband said to me a while ago, he loves this values work, and he said to me, you can always tell a person who's living in their highest value by what they focus on and what they spend most of their time doing. And that thought led me into this self-exploration, this further self-awareness, because when I reflected on my life after my dad, I realized that I wasn't living in that, and that when I was doing all these other kind of behaviors that didn't feel like self-sabotage or didn't look like it to the other world, but was so not on par with who I was, I realized that I had to stop and look into it. And I see this self-awareness as just another form, just another level of our recovery that we get to show up, so I'll leave it there for this slide.
Thank you, Robyn. I can resonate so much with so much of what you shared, and I always appreciate hearing your incredible insights. And I think that one reason I love listening to Robyn is that she does bring this really powerful sense of self-awareness that I know has not been cultivated easily. And I know that it's taken lots of very intentional work and practice, and I so admire that in her. And that's really what we are talking about is, especially if you feel like you're caught in one of those cycles, and so often these are cycles, how you can make an intentional shift to bringing awareness to what is going on for you, what it might be that you are avoiding intentionally or unintentionally. And so when we're talking about self-awareness, we're talking about taking intentional action through recognition of our own internal cues. So all of whether those are thoughts or feelings or physical sensations, when I talk to people often, they say, like, it feels like everything's really been cut off from the neck down. Maybe they're aware of their thoughts sort of spinning around, but when it comes to their emotional experience, their instincts, their gut, they've really learned to sort of shut those off for lots of self-protective reasons. So one of the important keys to cultivating this sense of self-awareness is really understanding how our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors are all interconnected with one another and mutually influence each other. And that emotions themselves are not dangerous. As much as they can feel like, as much as shame, for example, for me, can feel like it's going to literally kill me if I don't sort of shut it off. We know that that's never happened in the history of human experience, but it certainly feels like it. It absolutely does. So just a kind of tool to go back to our emotional hijacking sphere is recognizing, first of all, that emotions are, they're time limited, so they can't exist forever. It's physically impossible. And actually, when we think about those signals that the amygdala, again, is sending to our brains, it takes about, like scientists have studied this, it takes about 6 seconds for the amygdala to flood our brain with the chemicals. And those chemicals are the ones that I was saying before tell us whether we should approach something, avoid it, ignore it, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And so one of the kind of key things we can think about is if I can just wait 6 seconds until my amygdala is done flooding my higher order brain, I'm going to have better access to my brain. 6 seconds sounds like it's not all that long, but when you're in distress, it can feel like a long time. And there's a lot that you can be tempted to do and to react, to pick up something that is going to be harmful to you, or to scream in response to something, or just react in a way that's not very effective. So one of the first steps is to just take those 6 seconds, sometimes longer, because you might need it to get into a space where you can make a more effective decision. Shannon, if you want to go to the next slide. So the key here is that we want to be able to reflect, which is what our higher order brain can do, instead of react, which is all that our lower order brain can do. And when we can reflect, we can, again, take more intentional action. So another way that we can cultivate this is actually through, and Shannon and Robyn are such great examples of this, is through writing, because writing actually activates our logic, because it comes from our sort of logical side of the brain, even very creative writing. And so it requires that higher order brain to be sort of flipped on, and we can have a greater ability to be able to reflect on the events instead of reacting in the moment. So whether or not you're a writer or written an amazing book like these two, or amazing books, you can, anybody can do this, taking out a journal, a Post-it note even, and writing down something about the situation at hand, because it forces our brain to be able to reflect instead of react. The other, we can do, if writing's not your thing, we can also do other things that help us to reflect, like talking to somebody, a safe person. Ideally, you have in your life somebody that is willing to be a sounding board or to listen. I just thought of this. I hadn't thought about it before, ironically, but Shannon is a great person to listen. And if it's sort of combining two things here, writing an email to Shannon in at the Say It Brave inbox, letting her know just what is going on, maybe an intense urge to engage in something that is not going to be effective for you. Part of the Say It Brave community is that Shannon writes these lovely email responses and shares them with the community, and we really sort of help our whole community in dealing with things. So a lot of you'll notice that a lot of what I'm saying does require some level of pausing, and pausing is an important skill here. And again, it's not always easy, because our brain is telling us to react right in that moment. But when we're in crisis, we'll talk in a minute about what we can do in a crisis, but we have to recognize that when we are completely flooded with emotions, there's other skills that we might need to use to be able to get some distance between whatever the stimulus is and our response to it. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So one of the things once we started to self-reflect, what we want to do is to bring some awareness of what our emotional experience is, because that helps us sort of directly confront what we were saying earlier, which is that emotional avoidance. And going back to our culture and how uncomfortable it is with emotions, because we've always been, our culture is so full of discomfort around this topic, we haven't really developed an emotional language, most of us. We don't even know how to identify or describe what we're experiencing. And there's actually a term for this, kind of a fancy Greek term called alexithymia, that basically which literally translates to mean I have no words, but we use that term to describe the experience of I have no words for how I feel. And many of us who have experienced mental health challenges, we are, research has really demonstrated that we struggle more often with being able to do that. We have more alexithymia. So it really does take intentional practice to develop that emotional language and to cultivate it. It's a special kind of vocabulary. And to know that what we're describing in terms of our emotions are in the body. A lot of us think that emotions are in the brain, but emotions are experienced in our body, and we have all kinds of emotional receptors, not just up in our head, but in our gut, in the rest of our body. And so that's why when we have a gut feeling or, butterflies in our stomach, that's our body telling us that we're having an emotional experience. So if you notice that you are struggling to either stay with those physical feelings because they can feel so overwhelming, or to label them, there's lots of good things you can do. But I would put a strong plug-in for working with a therapist who can really lead you through that process, because and the therapy can take lots of different forms. But working with somebody who is sort of an emotional guide can be invaluable in being able to start to sit with some of this and respond to it in a different way.
I love what you said, Ashley, about the working with the therapist or writing about it, and speaking to people. I think for me, the self-awareness really comes when, I've been lucky. I have a couple of mentors, I have a therapist, and I have an incredible, loving friends and community, and my husband. So I feel very fortunate to be able to speak about those things that I think that once shamed me, or I felt that I shouldn't feel that way, or I shouldn't have that feeling anymore. And, when we decided that we were going to sell our things and sell our home and convert a school bus and travel the United States, it does sound very wild. But actually, it was an incredibly thoughtful and considerate effort. I had my two mentors that I met with for over a year and continue to. I had a therapist, and I had a very strategic plan. And the reason this came about is because I was stuck in the amygdala response. I was so caught up in my self-sabotage, I guess, behaviors. And again, I just want to say, because when I say that, I'm kind of like, what? That doesn't feel right. When I say self-sabotage, I want to be really clear that those behaviors that I acted in, it felt like, really, some of them felt like I was putting on my superhero cape and panties, and I was finding something that really worked for me to help me get through those times. It's just that those weren't those self-sabotage behaviors that I still can act out in. Some of them can still get caught up in my fear, and my first response go to is to overwork, is to put everybody else's needs before doing my self-care regime, to try to perfect something or myself. All those things can come up if I'm not careful, or if I choose to act on them. But when we decided to get on the bus, it was through a huge amount of soul searching. And when I came back from my dad's, I sat down with my husband, and we spoke about it. And we spoke about, well, and I think this, you guys, I think it's when you have somebody that you love reaching a different part of their life, or somebody passes, there is I think that window of reflection of what are you doing and what do you want your life to be. And that was certainly the case for me. And I'm not sure I'm not sure how long I would have been stuck in the cycle that I had created for myself, but when I got on the bus, I was very committed to, yes, changing my lifestyle, but this, the bus is only for a year, so this is not the lifestyle I'm going to keep, but changing my lifestyle and finding out who is Robyn really? Who is Robyn when you take away all the things that she should be or should have, or who is she and what does she want? And when I first got on the bus, because I just want to say, just because I got on a bus doesn't mean that instantly these behaviors that I used to use to soothe myself kind of left me. No, they were just taken with me on the bus, and I had to really become very conscious of how did they serve me. It's kind of like getting that quick fix when actually that quick fix really prevented me from my long-term goals. And so I had to really look at some of them, and I was super surprised at what I found out about myself. And I want to share a little bit about what I found out about myself, because I wonder whether you, whoever's listening to this, might relate. So the one thing I found out about myself, which kind of cracks me up a little, I'm not sure why, but I do many projects at once. Like when I say many, I mean many. Like I've usually got about 5 projects going at one time. And I thought that that's what I had to do in order to be a successful woman. What I figured out is that's not what Robyn can actually sustain. That's why I have all these anxiety and panic attacks cycles. So what's interesting is this kind of behavior that I utilize is this very behavior that actually ended up short-circuiting me, if you will, every few months. I can't be that busy. I just, my body will respond to it. And so I've realized that my lifestyle has to change, that I can do 2 projects, maybe 3 if they're a one-off, but certainly there is a limit when my gut says, hey, Robyn, if you decide to go beyond that limit, then you're going to pay the consequences. And self-awareness just gives me a chance to make that choice. Like as you said about the 6th second of the brain, I actually can take that moment before I get to the crisis stage of panic and anxiety. If I listen to myself and lean into it, I can actually make a decision where I can, disembark. I can get off, that kind of concept. The other thing that I realized through this awareness is that I had such a fear of taking up space. And I don't know if Shannon and Ashley, you can get this, but I just realized this. I had just done an event in Sacramento, and we had driven up to Marin County, and so I had two kind of moments of self-awareness. One was in Marin County and one was in North Bend, Oregon. The first one was I woke up, I had my coffee, I got straight into work, let's do this. And then all of a sudden my gut said, you need to get some of this anxiety. You haven't self-care, you haven't eaten your breakfast, you haven't exercised. You need to honor this. Heads up, it's time to honor it. And I looked around the bus. We live in a 250 square foot bus, okay? And like I'm nearly touching the ceiling now. So there's not a lot of room. And so I look around the bus and I look outside, and there's a camper van of somebody's over one side, the bus on the other, and there's like a huge open space. And I'm like, what am I going to do? Like there's no gym, or I don't, what am I going to do? And I thought, you know what? I am going to go outside and I'm going to exercise. Well, I got to tell you, that was so hard for me. But when I did it and I took up that space and allowed myself to just honor where I was at, something shifted. And then the next time I was in North Bend, which was just after, it's a couple of days after, the RV park that I was in happened to have a gym. And so I go to the gym and I see on the right side, it has this really cool smart mat. And on the other side, it has a hanger for your jackets. And my jacket is on the floor. And I look around and there's a mirror in front of me, and I look in the mirror and I say, oh my God, Robyn, that smart mat is for you. You are included in those people that get to use that mat. And that hanger there is where you get to hang your jacket. I don't know why, but I thought it was for somebody else, and taking my space. So I got the mat out and I rolled it out and I used it, and I put my jacket up, and I wouldn't have got that if I wasn't able to, this bus has given me this amazing opportunity to be in self-awareness. And you don't have to be on a bus to be in self-awareness, but there is something from taking myself out of a situation that didn't work for me. And I want to end on this, and I hope I'm making sense of everything, you guys. I do hope that you've taken away something from me. I started this journey for three reasons. I wanted to really find out who Robyn was, and I wanted to allow myself some joy. The second thing is I really wanted to model for my girls what it was like to honor who we are and to hold the space for ourselves. And the third thing was to advocate for those struggling with mental health and addiction. And I will have to say that it turns out that this trip has been about me modeling behavior for myself and advocating for myself. And I wish that of you, for you, because I think the self-sabotaging, if we allow it to, can teach us a lot about ourselves. And when we get into self-awareness of it, we get to really make decisions, because that's what recovery offers us.
So many chills. Thank you, Robyn.
Well, thank you, guys.
We just wanted to sort of end on the note that recognizing that often, less than effective behaviors can arise when, particularly when we feel like we've been talking about, totally emotionally flooded, and that we're really in a crisis situation. And so we wanted to make sure that we noted some of the things that you can do if you feel like you are in a crisis, not sort of just maybe inclined to do something that feels, less than optimal, but you really feel like you could bring harm upon yourself, and which is the thing that, of course, we most want to avoid. And so a couple of things that I think can be helpful when we're reaching that crisis stage, and sometimes it takes recognizing what that doing some work to understand when we're getting there, and hopefully intervening even sooner. But if you've gotten there, we really recommend calling a support person, doing what you can to change your physiology. Like we talked about before, emotions are in the body. And so whether that's, taking a shower, or doing some physical movement, changing our physiology can be really helpful in just sort of overriding some of the physical sensations of like an overwhelming emotion. Go to a different location. And I love that Robyn mentioned that the quote from her husband, and in terms of really understanding our values and goals. Once we're in a state where we can access that, once we've sort of brought down our physiology, going back to what we know is most important to us, and the direction that we want to go, that those things, our values, will always be our guide if we allow them to be. So with that, we so appreciate you being here tonight. I think Shannon's gonna share with us a little bit about how we're gonna handle questions tonight.
Hey, everybody. First of all, Robyn, thank you so much. I feel like my heart just exploded, especially, when you put your jacket on the hanger and you got on that mat. And I think, there's something to be said, this idea that Ashley talked about, that in our society, we have this pressure to be happy all the time. And it can be so hard and so scary to bring any of our self-sabotaging behaviors to the light, whether that's, something like substance use or an eating disorder, or something that's maybe more common and revered in our society, like perfectionism or overworking. And there's this thought when and Ashley's explained why these things are so easy to kind of get stuck in a cycle with. But, I'm sure you've experienced it, Robyn, and I've experienced, I'm bad. I don't count because I keep doing this. And so Robyn also said that, self-sabotage, yes, and Ashley said it's a prickly, icky word, but it really can be an opportunity for learning. And the learning moments are not these big, grand epiphanies, right? But these small moments in which we, tell the truth, or we see our own truth. And we're constantly, as long as we're here on earth, I think all of us are dealing with trying to face what we feel inside, and without numbing out or sabotaging in some way. And so knowing that we aren't alone in it is so, so very important, and that we can talk about it. And our goal tonight was to have a real talk with you guys about it, and what you're going through and where you're at, and especially to give you the opportunity to connect with Robyn, since she shared so much of her story with us tonight. But unfortunately, we are having some technical difficulties. So do not fear. We want to really hear your thoughts and feelings and experiences with self-sabotage and self-awareness. So we are going to host a Facebook Live in which you can ask all your questions and share your thoughts and feelings, and we'll respond to you. We are so sorry it can't happen right now in our webinar, but I think the Facebook Live will be cool. And I think it can give us all time to kind of reflect on Robyn's story and what we heard tonight. I do want to say, we talked a lot about the power of the pause and reaching out for help, that Say It Brave is here for you. And if you're frustrated tonight because you couldn't get on the webinar, or you're frustrated with a certain behavior you feel stuck in, please email us at sayitbrave@eatingrecovery.com. I'm by no means a therapist. I'm like learning new things every day. I don't have all the answers, but I do have a heck of a lot of compassion, because I just love you guys, and I love our community, and I love our honesty. And so, please share your thoughts, your urges. your struggles, and I'm here to support you at sayitbrave@eatingrecovery.com. You'll also be receiving an email about how to tune into our Facebook Live so we can have more of a discussion with you, and so that you'll have the opportunity to connect more with Robyn too. So stay tuned for that. I also want to give a huge shout out to Wide Wonder. I know I personally, as a mom who feels like she's losing her shit all the time, sorry, but just like, I mean, life has never been more hectic or crazy. And I follow Wide Wonder on all their social media platforms because it's really refreshing for me to see a family unit living in such an honest, intentional, transparent way. And it helps me to be more honest and transparent in my life. I mean, I'm proud to say it's been 2 years since I last backed into a car in my own driveway. You know, and I really have. I've been working hard with my therapist to bring, you know, some to see like what Robyn said, to take up space, to take up time, to be mindful, to say no, but it is so hard. And so, you know, I've found a lot of encouragement in following Robyn's family and story. So if you go to widewonder.life, there's a zero stigma pledge, which I've signed. I'd encourage all of us to sign. It's a really powerful thing. It was powerful for me to do for myself, and to think about just even the thought of what would zero stigma look like in my family or in my work environment. So please check out widewonder.life, and if you're looking for some encouragement about creating self-awareness in your own life, please follow Robyn and her family's journey. It's really awesome. And
thank you, Shannon. Yeah, that's very sweet.
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like we're always gushing on these these online events, but really we're here because we're opening our hearts up, and we want to hear from you guys. We want to really know the moments in which not only you're struggling with maybe a cycle you feel you can't get out of, but when you know, hang your coat on the, let's say, hang your coat on the jacket, hang your coat on the hanger, when you get on the mat, when you take up space. One of our community members just shared with me, she had a bunch of unhealthy kind of like diet drinks in her trunk that she got, and she was thinking about really thinking about going back into some old behaviors. And she showed up to a therapy appointment, and she went through the whole appointment just, you know, talking, not mentioning all these diet drinks she had in her trunk. At the very end, and I'm telling you, it can be as a 2 seconds of courage can be so important. She said, got a bunch of diet stuff in my trunk. And I don't want to take it out, but I feel like maybe I could, but I don't know. And she said she just started talking. She didn't even know what she was saying. It didn't make sense. And her therapist said, let's go to your car together. And they went to her car, and this is one of our Say It Brave members. They opened the trunk, and this person thought her therapist would just be like, all right, let's get rid of this stuff. And she said, you know, there's a garbage can over there. The therapist asked her, do you want to throw it out? Do you want to throw it out? And she picked it up and she threw it in the garbage can. She said she immediately had to, like, oh God, what did I just do? But she walked away. She got back in her car. She said goodbye to her therapist, and she drove away. And she wrote an email to Say It Brave and said, it was only 2 seconds, and I felt like such an idiot, and I didn't even know what I was saying. But she said, I'm really glad I said it. And so, you know, sometimes self-awareness, we need some help with it. It's hard when we're in an eating disorder, or we're in substance use, or we're in our perfectionism or alcoholism, to have clarity. So sometimes we just need to open ourselves up to a safe person, like Ashley said, like a therapist or a support person, a mentor, to help us find that clarity. And there's no shame in that at all.
I will also say to Shannon that I think that's why this is so powerful what you and Ashley are doing here, because there, you know, Tim, my husband, who I love very much, he says connection is the currency to wellness. And that's not his saying, it's somebody else's who I fail to remember right now. I apologize to the person who wrote that. But I do think that community really supports recovery, because we're witnessing each other and we're connecting, and we realize that what is in our head is not uncommon, but also it doesn't have to run the show. When we witness it, when we talk about it within a community, it really does dispel it. And I think that that's a powerful thing. So again, thanks for what you guys do.
Definitely. And thanks to Ashley, you know, she created a self-reflection tool, which we hope you were able to use during this talk, or even now you can go through some of the questions and reflect on your own life. And we also will be sending you a resource that we hope is helpful to you in creating more self-awareness in your life. So again, we thank you all for joining us tonight. We really apologize about the technical difficulties, but we promise that we're going to connect soon and touch base on where you're at, and not only maybe these self-sabotaging behaviors, but your victories and your triumphs, and the small and big ways you're creating self-awareness. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Keep braving.